They say you don't truly know the value of peace until the silence around you is broken, not by sound, but by a feeling. It was a Wednesday evening when that feeling first crept into my bones, slow, heavy, and invisible, like a fog rising from the floorboards of my living room, curling its way around my ankles as I sat watching my 17-year-old son, Danny, shovel spoonfuls of spaghetti into his mouth with the kind of hunger only teenagers possess. He had just come back from football practice, sweaty, smiling, still talking about a play he pulled off that his coach apparently called the cleanest tackle of the season, and as I sat there watching him, his messy hair, his long limbs, the slight hook in his nose, I felt it again, that quiet, unwelcome chill of something being wrong. I don't know why I noticed it right then. Maybe it was the way he laughed, or the way the evening sun hit his cheek and made his skin glow just a little too unfamiliar. Maybe it was simply the look in his eyes that I suddenly realized didn't match mine, not even close. And then he asked me the question, the one that would tear open the floor beneath my feet and leave me free-falling into a kind of grief I didn't even know existed. "Hey Dad," he said, casual as can be, twirling his fork, his voice so light it made my heart feel heavy, "how come I don't look anything like you?" I remember my smile freezing in place, my breath catching just slightly, nothing obvious, nothing he'd notice, but inside, something primal shifted, something old and angry and terrified all at once, like a door to a room I'd nailed shut years ago had just swung open. I laughed it off, of course, muttering some half-assed line about kids looking like their moms, but deep down, I wasn't laughing, I was remembering. Remembering my brother's smirk. His laugh. The one night he and my wife drank too much wine. The night I thought I had imagined. The night I buried so deep I'd nearly convinced myself it never happened. I waited until Danny had gone upstairs, until the dishwasher was humming softly and the house had fallen into that eerie kind of quiet that only old homes know, the kind of quiet that feels like it's listening. I stood in front of the mirror in the hallway, staring into my own reflection, and for the first time in 17 years, I didn't see a proud father or a faithful husband, I saw a fool. A man who had spent almost 2 decades raising a son who might not even be his. A man who worked weekends and birthdays to pay for piano lessons, little league, and braces. A man who never once thought to ask why his only child looked more like his missing brother than like him. And in that moment, that cold, paralyzing, suffocating moment, I knew. I knew my life was built on a lie. And I was going to burn it all to the ground to find the truth. I didn't sleep that night, not even for a second, and not because of the question my son asked, but because of how quickly and completely my mind spiraled into obsession. I lay there next to Linda, the woman I'd been married to for 21 years, listening to the soft rhythm of her breathing, steady and peaceful, like a song from a life I no longer believed in. I stared at the ceiling, wide-eyed, as memories I hadn't thought about in over a decade came back with vicious clarity, details I once chalked up to coincidence now ringing out like sirens in a dark room. I remembered the weekend I took a solo trip to help my mother after her hip surgery, only to come back to a house that felt just slightly shifted. I remembered the quiet phone calls Linda used to take in the laundry room, the ones she always claimed were from clients, back when she did freelance marketing. I remembered the bottle of wine that was half empty on the kitchen counter one night when she swore she'd been home alone. God help me, I even remembered Mike, my younger brother, flashing that easy grin of his and winking when he handed me a cigar at Danny's christening. "Strong genes in this family," he said, and I remember laughing, clueless, shaking his hand like a goddamn idiot. By sunrise, my pillow was damp with sweat, and I had made up my mind, not out of paranoia, not out of insecurity, but from something far more dangerous, instinct. I waited until Linda left for her Pilates class, the one she never missed on Thursday mornings, and I went straight to our hallway closet, not for a jacket or a coat, but for the storage bins where I kept our old photo albums, back when people still printed pictures instead of letting them rot in the cloud. I sat cross-legged on the hardwood floor and pulled out the album from the year Danny was born, flipping through the pages so fast it felt like thumbing a flipbook of my own downfall. There it was, hospital photos, Linda in her gown, me holding the baby, my eyes red from crying, my smile stretched from relief, not pride. And then came the visitors, my parents, her sister, and of course, Mike. There he was, holding Danny, grinning ear to ear, and for the first time I noticed what should have been obvious from the beginning, the same dimple in the left cheek, the same narrow jawline, the same deep-set hazel eyes. Eyes I never had. Eyes I never passed down. My heart didn't break, it cracked open, violently, like a windshield hit by a brick at 60 miles an hour. I sat there, gripping that photo like it might explain itself, like if I stared long enough, it would rewrite the truth I was staring at. But it didn't. It just stared back at me, that picture of my brother holding the child I believed was mine, and I felt the cold hand of rage curl around my spine. I wasn't angry at Danny. God, no. I loved that boy more than life itself. But I was furious at the woman upstairs who had lied to me every single day for 17 years, who had let me give my soul to a child she knew might not be mine, and I knew, in that moment, that the life I thought I was living wasn't just cracked. It was counterfeit. And I was going to tear it apart, piece by piece, until I found the truth hiding beneath every smile, every photo, every kiss she ever gave me. People always said Mike was the kind of man who could light up a room just by walking into it, charming, reckless, magnetic in all the ways I wasn't, the kind of guy who never worked too hard because he never had to, because the world always seemed to bend in his favor like it owed him something. Growing up, I was the older brother, the responsible one, the steady hand on the wheel while he rode in the passenger seat with the windows down and a cigarette dangling from his lips, laughing like nothing could ever touch him. And for a long time, I didn't mind it. I figured every family had a golden child and a workhorse, and I knew which one I was, until he crossed a line I didn't even know I had drawn until it was too late. See, I hadn't thought about Mike in years, not really. He disappeared from our lives shortly after Danny was born, vanished like a shadow when the lights came on. No calls, no visits, no Christmas cards. Just gone. And back then, Linda said she didn't know why. He was always unpredictable, she told me. Probably ran off chasing some woman or some dumb dream. I believed her. God help me, I actually believed her. But now, sitting there with that photograph in my hand, staring into Mike's face as he held my newborn son with that smug grin, the grin I'd seen 1,000 times when we were kids and he'd stolen something of mine just to watch me get mad, the silence of the past started to make a horrible kind of sense. My gut twisted as I remembered the last real conversation we had. It was late, maybe a month before Danny was born, and Mike had dropped by unannounced with a six-pack and that arrogant glint in his eye. I remember him leaning in close, his voice slurred and low, saying something that felt like a joke at the time, but now hit like a confession whispered through a locked door. You sure about this whole fatherhood thing, Johnny? Never know what kind of surprises life throws at you. I thought he meant the responsibility. But he meant himself. He meant Linda. And here's the thing that makes my blood run cold, I should have seen it. I did see it. But I didn't want to see it. All the little moments, the way Linda used to laugh a little too hard at Mike's jokes, the way she straightened her hair when she knew he was coming over, the night she insisted I go to my buddy's bachelor party even though I didn't want to, practically shoving me out the door. I didn't see betrayal. I saw coincidence. Because I wanted to believe my life was safe. That my family was real. That my wife loved me. But now, the truth was clawing its way to the surface like something buried alive, and I knew one thing with sickening certainty: Mike didn't just leave. He was pushed out, paid off, or forced to vanish. And my wife, the woman I built my world around, was at the center of it all. It's a strange thing, ordering a DNA test for your own child. It makes you feel like a monster and a fool at the same time. The kind of man who betrays his own blood just by asking a question out loud, even if that question has been screaming inside your head for days, maybe even years, hiding beneath the surface like a splinter you never realized was buried until the flesh around it turned red. I remember sitting at my desk, hand trembling slightly as I clicked through the order page like I was buying a pair of shoes, and not, in reality, unraveling the very thread that had stitched my identity together as a father. The test arrived 3 days later, quiet and unassuming, in a plain white box that might as well have carried a bomb inside it. I waited until Linda took a long shower. She had no idea what I was planning, and I wasn't about to tip her off. I swabbed the inside of Danny's mouth while he slept, whispering apologies he would never hear, the guilt curling up in my stomach like a dying thing. I sent it off that same morning, breathing shallow and sharp, like every movement might set off an alarm only I could hear. And then came the worst part, the waiting. 3 days stretched into an eternity, a purgatory made of small talk and forced smiles and pretending that the world wasn't tilting beneath my feet. Linda had no clue. She kissed me goodbye, talked about bills and groceries, showed me Pinterest photos for a kitchen remodel as if nothing was cracking beneath the walls of our home. Every word out of her mouth sounded like static. Every smile felt like a mask she was stapling to her own skin. I watched her like a detective watching a suspect, only worse, because this suspect slept beside me, said she loved me, or the ring I gave her while she twisted the knife a little deeper each time she said, "Our son." When the results finally arrived in my email, I couldn't open them right away. My hand hovered over the mouse, cold sweat beading at the base of my neck. I must have sat there for 10 minutes, staring at the subject line, "Your DNA results are ready." Those 6 words felt like a verdict being read aloud in a courtroom built inside my heart. And when I clicked it, everything changed. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't break anything. I just stopped. Like someone had yanked the cord out of the wall and shut off the whole machine that was me. 0% match. 0. After 17 years of bedtime stories, scraped knees, basketball games, and late-night fevers, the science came back with the coldest number in the universe, 0. My son, the boy I raised with every fiber of love I had to give, was not mine. Biologically, legally, scientifically, he belonged to someone else. To Mike. And in that moment, something inside me snapped, not in a loud or dramatic way, but with the quiet efficiency of a man who just lost everything and still managed to button his shirt, fix his collar, and plan revenge. It's incredible how easily someone can lie to your face when they believe the truth is buried too deep to ever claw its way to the surface, and my wife, Linda, had been doing it with an Olympic-level performance for nearly 2 decades. The morning I confronted her, the sky outside was a dull, overcast gray, the kind of day that presses down on your shoulders like it knows something you don't, the kind of day made for confessions, or executions. I waited until Danny had gone to school, backpack swinging, earphones in, not knowing that the foundation of his life was already crumbling behind him. Linda was in the kitchen, humming to herself while stirring her coffee, wearing the same navy robe she'd had since we were newlyweds, like she was still that woman, faithful, warm, safe. I watched her for a second too long, long enough for the heat of disgust to override the tremor in my gut, and then I just laid the envelope on the counter between us like it was a bomb with the timer still ticking. Her hand froze mid-stir. "What's this?" she asked, her smile shrinking just slightly, like it was being pulled from her face by invisible strings. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. She opened it with that fake, curious expression she used when pretending not to know something. I'd seen it 100 times at family dinners when she was pretending she hadn't already heard gossip before repeating it. But when her eyes scanned the page, that mask shattered. I saw it, the exact second her world tilted. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She blinked. Swallowed. Then, softly, the whisper came, brittle and weightless, "You tested him." My voice came back colder than I expected, sharp enough to cut through bone. I didn't need to. I already knew. But I had to see you choke on it. She looked away, jaw clenched, hands trembling just slightly, not from guilt, but from losing control of the narrative she had been directing like a film for 17 years. And finally, after an eternity of silence, she muttered the 3 words that flipped my world upside down for the second time that week: "It was Mike." I didn't scream. I didn't slam a chair or flip the table, even though every muscle in my body begged to erupt, to rip this kitchen apart like it could somehow reverse time and erase the moment my brother took everything from me. I just stood there, staring at the woman I married, the woman I built a life with, who looked up at me now with tears that were too little, too late. It was a mistake, she said, shaking her head like that excuse could erase the years I lost, the lies she fed me, the love I gave under false pretenses. It only happened once, maybe twice, she added, and that maybe hit harder than a punch. She tried to close the gap between us, reaching out like she still had the right to touch me. I didn't know Danny wasn't yours, she pleaded. I swear, I thought, but I cut her off with a laugh, bitter and hollow, the kind that echoes in your chest long after it leaves your throat. You didn't know? I said, stepping back. No, Linda, you didn't want to know. Because it was easier to let me carry the lie than to admit you destroyed this family with a choice you made in a dark room 17 years ago. Something changed in the house after that morning, something so subtle, so bone deep, that even the walls seemed to breathe differently. The silence wasn't just awkward anymore, it was surgical, carved with a blade so sharp it didn't bleed right away. Linda moved like a ghost, floating through rooms she used to fill with laughter, now barely making eye contact, like the very structure of our home recoiled every time she touched it. I stopped pretending. No more fake smiles. No more, how was your day? I went to work, came home, made dinner for Danny, and barely acknowledged her presence. But the real fracture? It wasn't between her and me. It was between the truth and the lie we were still pretending to live inside. And what she didn't know, couldn't have guessed, was that while she moped around trying to play the part of the guilty wife begging for redemption, I was watching her. Listening to her. Tracking her phone with software I installed 3 days after the DNA results came in. Because I didn't trust her tears. And I was right not to. One night, about 2 weeks after the confrontation, while Danny was at his girlfriend's place and the air between us was thick with everything we weren't saying, I saw it. Her phone buzzed just once, a short vibration, and she got up too fast, too eager, like a teenager sneaking a text under the covers. I followed. Quietly. Like a hunter. She went into the laundry room, the same room she used to sneak calls from 17 years ago, and whispered into her phone, her back turned, not knowing I was behind the cracked door. I told you not to text me, she hissed. He's suspicious. Silence. Then she added, no, I don't think he'll find you. He doesn't know you're back in town. I froze. Back in town. That was the line that broke the levee. That was the line that confirmed everything I feared but hadn't dared to articulate. Mike wasn't gone. He was here. Somewhere nearby. And not only had Linda betrayed me 17 years ago, but she was still tangled up in whatever poison they started back then. I didn't confront her. Not yet. Because now, I had a different mission. I wasn't just a man crawling out of betrayal, I was a father planning a quiet war. Over the next week, I changed. I became precise. I became deliberate. I called an attorney. I moved money into a private account. I found a friend who worked private security and handed him Mike's last known photo. And at night, I lay awake in a separate room, listening to the floorboards creak beneath her feet, wondering how a woman I once loved so completely could lie so convincingly for so long. She tried once, just once, to initiate some pathetic kind of intimacy, touching my arm gently, whispering, "We can get through this." And I looked her straight in the eye, voice flat as stone, and replied, "You are through, Linda. You just haven't realized it yet." That was the night she finally cried, and for the first time, I didn't feel a damn thing. I found him at a grimy bar on the edge of town, the kind of place where daylight goes to die, where the beer is cheap, the jukebox skips, and the air smells like sweat and broken promises. He was sitting in a corner booth, shoulders hunched, nursing a whiskey like it was the last thing tying him to this planet. I wouldn't have recognized him at first. He looked smaller than I remembered, older, ragged around the edges, like life had been slowly chewing on him for years and spitting him out in pieces. But then he turned his head, and there it was, that face, the one I'd seen reflected in my son's eyes every single day since the truth tore through me like a hurricane. And just like that, the world around us collapsed into silence. I walked over, pulled the chair out across from him, and sat down without saying a word. He stared at me, blank at first, then recognition spread across his face like mold on damp wood. "Johnny," he said, with a half-smirk that reeked of guilt and arrogance, "I was wondering when you'd show up." For a long, tense second, I didn't respond. I just studied him, the way his hands trembled slightly when he lifted his glass, the way he avoided eye contact but still kept the grin, like he knew I wouldn't punch him in public. When I finally spoke, my voice didn't sound like mine, it was lower, colder, like something inside me had calcified. "Is he yours?" I asked, and I already knew the answer, but I needed to hear it from the devil's mouth. Mike sighed, leaned back, and ran a hand through his thinning hair, the bravado slipping for just a second. "Yeah," he said. "He is." I didn't know for sure at the time. Linda told me she thought it was yours, and honestly, I didn't want to fight you for it. I figured, you'd be the better dad anyway. He laughed at that, a short, bitter chuckle that made my stomach turn. "And look at you," he added, "you did great. Kid turned out alright, didn't he? Like I'd just been doing him a favor. Like I hadn't had to give everything I had to raise a boy who was never mine, while he disappeared into the night like a coward wrapped in cologne and cowardice. I didn't throw the drink in his face. I didn't break his nose on the edge of the table, even though every cell in my body begged me to. I just stood up, slow and deliberate, leaned in close, and whispered words that hit harder than any punch I could throw. "You didn't just steal my wife, Mike. You stole my life. You buried a landmine in my home and let me walk over it every day for 17 years. And I hope every night you close your eyes, you see his face and know that you're not a father, you're a mistake that someone else had to fix." Then I walked out, not looking back, not caring if he followed, because I wasn't there for vengeance, not yet. I was there to bury whatever brotherly love had survived the last 2 decades. And that night, as I drove home in silence, I realized something terrifying and freeing all at once: the worst part of betrayal isn't what it takes from you. It's what it turns you into. And I was becoming someone they should have never messed with. I've always believed the cleanest revenge is the kind served cold, not out of rage, not from chaos, but from calculation. Anyone can throw a punch in a moment of anger, but it takes a certain kind of man to stand in the ashes of betrayal and build a guillotine with his bare hands, slow and silent, while the people who wronged him smile, unaware that their heads are already in the basket. After that meeting with Mike, I stopped being a man crawling through grief. I became something else entirely: calm, focused, and terrifyingly methodical. That night, I walked into my home, the same home that had turned into a mausoleum for every lie I'd ever swallowed, and I made a list. Not a list of names, but a list of moves. Because revenge, real revenge, isn't about striking back. It's about taking everything, their comfort, their illusions, their safety, their control, and leaving them nothing but themselves to scream at when the dust settles. I hired a divorce attorney that week, not just any attorney, but the kind of lawyer who doesn't advertise, the kind who handles cases for politicians and men with more money than mercy. I gave her every piece of ammo I'd gathered: the DNA test, the surveillance data, the call logs, the timestamps, the voice recordings of Linda whispering into her phone when she thought I was asleep. I laid it all out, not because I was desperate, but because I wanted the process to be clean, legal, and permanent. No room for loopholes. No chance of redemption. I also moved my savings, my pension, and my stocks into a trust, airtight, bulletproof, and out of Linda's reach. Then I scheduled one final meeting with my accountant, because if she was going to suffer, I needed to make sure she felt it where she always cared most: her lifestyle. The kitchen remodel she kept raving about. Cancelled. The cruise she had planned with her friends next spring. Gone. Every thread of comfort she used to wrap herself in. I was unraveling it slowly, one stitch at a time. But the part that tore me in half, the move that nearly broke me, was sitting Danny down in our backyard, under the old oak tree he used to climb as a boy, and telling him everything. Not the rage. Not the betrayal. Just the truth. I told him I loved him more than life, that nothing he had done or ever could do would change that. But I also told him he deserved to know where he came from. At first, he didn't speak. He just stared at me like I'd set fire to the sky. Then he asked, in a voice small and cracking, "So, Uncle Mike?" I nodded. He stood up and walked away, not in anger, not in hate, just stunned. And as I watched him disappear into the dusk, I knew what Linda had stolen wasn't just a marriage. It was identity. It was peace. But now, I was taking something back. Not from Danny. From her. And she had no idea the fall she was about to take would be slow, public, and irreversible. There's a moment, sitting on that cold courtroom bench with your life laid out in manila folders and whispered legalese, where time doesn't just slow down, it starts to rot. I sat there in my pressed navy suit, not to impress, but to remind everyone in that room that I wasn't a man undone by rage or hysteria, but a man who had spent months, years, really, playing the long game, waiting for the precise moment to strike the match and watch everything Linda built with her lies turn to ash. She sat across from me, dressed in cream, probably trying to look innocent, soft, like the kind of woman who had simply made a mistake. But her face was tight, her eyes darting between her attorney and the judge like she knew exactly what was coming and had no way to stop it. And then my lawyer stood, calm as a surgeon, and began unveiling the evidence, not dramatically, not like in the movies, but with the kind of quiet precision that makes a person's skin crawl, each revelation another stone laid on top of a collapsing house. The DNA test, the call logs, the texts, the voice recordings, the financial transactions, every detail delivered with surgical cruelty, cutting away the layers of her defense until all that was left was the truth, naked and irreversible. I watched the judge, a stern, gray-haired woman who barely blinked through the entire hearing, as she flipped through the evidence binder, her lips tightening every time she reached a new page. When it came time for Linda to speak, her voice shook, and for the first time, she wasn't rehearsed. She wasn't clever. She was desperate. She begged for forgiveness, tried to frame her betrayal as something born from loneliness, tried to explain that Danny was the light of her life, and that none of this should break apart a family. But it was too late. The damage was already done, and this courtroom wasn't for fixing wounds, it was for issuing judgment. And when the judge ruled in my favor, when she granted me the house, full legal guardianship of Danny, and the majority of the marital assets, Linda finally broke. She cried, sure, but not the kind of crying that comes from regret or reflection. It was the crying of someone who realizes they've lost their safety net, their leverage, their shield. She cried for herself, not for me, not for Danny. And when it was over, when the gavel came down like a gunshot and the silence afterward felt like thunder, I stood, buttoned my jacket, and walked past her without a glance. She reached out and grabbed my wrist, her grip weak, shaking. "Please," she whispered, mascara streaking down her face like ink on wet paper, "don't do this. We can fix it." I didn't pull away. I looked her dead in the eyes and said the last words I'd ever give her, "You already did this. I'm just letting it fall." Then I walked out of that courtroom and into the light, not victorious, not triumphant, but free. And for the first time in years, the air didn't taste like betrayal. It tasted like peace. It's strange how quiet peace can be. Not the kind that comes from meditation or Sunday mornings, I'm talking about earned peace, the kind that rises from the ashes of everything you thought you needed and leaves behind only what matters. A year after the divorce, I barely recognized the man I used to be, not in the mirror, not in my habits, not in the way I move through the world. The house feels different now, not because I changed the furniture or painted the walls, but because it no longer holds her lies in the drywall, no longer echoes with conversations that meant one thing on the surface and something entirely different beneath. Danny and I are closer than we've ever been, not because he forgave me for telling the truth, but because he saw that I did it with love, not vengeance. He chose to stay, not out of obligation, but because he realized that DNA doesn't make a father, sacrifice does. And every time I hear him call me, Dad, it reminds me that even after everything I lost, I still won something they can never touch. As for Linda, she's exactly where she belongs, nowhere. Word around town is that she's working retail, living in a rented apartment, blaming everyone but herself for the hole she dug. The last I heard, Mike ran off again, surprise surprise, once her usefulness ran out and the money dried up. No wedding, no co-parenting fairy tale, no second chance at the fantasy she risked everything to chase. Just loneliness, bills, and the dull ache of knowing the world no longer believes her sob story. And that's the cruelest kind of justice, not rage, not revenge, but irrelevance. I don't think she ever believed there'd be consequences. People like her never do. They live in the moment, thinking they're clever enough to rewrite reality with each new lie. But reality has a way of catching up, and when it does, it doesn't knock. It breaks the door down and drags them into the light. Now, I've rebuilt. I met someone, a woman who doesn't need to lie to feel powerful, who doesn't manipulate silence to win arguments, who listens when I speak and speaks when it matters. She knows what I've been through, and instead of treating me like damaged goods, she treats me like someone who's been forged in fire. I'm not the same man who ignored his instincts, who mistook convenience for trust and routine for love. I've changed. And that's the twist Linda never saw coming. She thought she was breaking me. But all she did was set me free. So if you're listening to this, and you're where I was, doubting yourself, stuck in the fog, haunted by a smile that hides 1,000 lies, let me tell you this, you will survive. And when you do, you won't just get your life back. You'll build a better one, from the ground up.